we're delighted to have Professor Darrin McMahon with us. Professor McMahon is a historian and author of several prize-winning books about happiness, genius, and equality. He is currently professor of history at Dartmouth College and previously chair of the history department. Before Dartmouth, he was a distinguished research professor at Florida State University. He holds a PhD in history from Yale. Professor McMahon, it is great to have you here today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks so much.
So I'm really looking forward to this chat because sometimes we talk a lot more about economics specifically, and we don't sort of get into, I think, some things that surround economics that are really, really important. So, it's interesting. You're a historian of ideas, and you've really looked through ideas about genius and happiness and now inequality, which I think we're going to spend a lot of time on. What made you decide that you were going to be a historian of ideas?
I wrote my very first book about people who fought against the Enlightenment in France, this movement for greater kind of liberty and fraternity and equality in the 18th century. And the people I was writing about were opposed to that movement. They saw it as threatening to stability, social stability, political stability, familial stability. And in fact, they fought a culture war against it. I finished that book. I was very proud of it. I published it as Enemies of the Enlightenment. And I don't know, I think maybe 10 or 15 people in the world were interested. And my parents said, gosh, you've done all this education and spent all this time studying. Maybe you should work on something that has a little bit more resonance. And at the time, I was a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University, and I was teaching their Great Books program that all undergraduates there have to teach. And teaching these books that I had claimed to have read for many years, Aristotle and Plato and so forth. And the theme of happiness just sort of leapt off the page. It's a central preoccupation in the Western intellectual tradition. And I thought, you know what? I should write a book about happiness. It was in the air and people were, interested in it. And so I went ahead and did that, and it seemed to work. And then I started to do that again with my next book about genius. And then this book too. The through line is that all these ideas, happiness, genius, equality, are ideas that emerge in the 18th century in a really powerful way. They have backstories and kind of prehistories, and they have long afterlives. But the 18th century is the cauldron in which they're forged. And so that's the through line for me. I'm an 18th century historian who can't stay there. I like to range backward and forward.
Well, that's good because I think sometimes if you're really laser focused into a certain spot in history, you're really great at that. But I think sometimes the most compelling books you read are the ones that take, 3 steps back and give you the sweep of, why things happen. And I think sometimes, the historians don't teach that enough. It's just, very focused on, the counterculture against the Enlightenment. I sort of Neil Ferguson I like a lot because he does exactly that. He takes 5 steps back and gives you the sweep of history, which is really great. But I want to talk about your latest book, your latest book, Equality, and people seem to love equality. If you say, does anyone not love equality? You'd probably be driven out of, out of academia or anywhere else if you didn't love equality. But, the question is, what is equality? Equality of what? And, equality with whom? So, do people even think about that? Equality of what?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Aristotle says very early, and Aristotle writes a lot about equality, and he says, all people will agree that justice is a form of equality. But then he poses the very question that you posed: equality of what and equality for whom? And that's a question that emerges over and over again. More recently in the 20th century, the great now Harvard economist Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner, posed the same question: equality of what and equality for whom? And that's where it gets messy. I wrote this book focused on the idea of equality and look at different types of equality: political equality, gender equality, economic equality. But the devil is often in the details. So yes, there's this kind of received idea that equality is a good thing, and yet when you scratch the surface a little bit, it gets more complicated and maybe even darker.
Can you get sort of, even in our country, and we prize our liberty, although I think of sort of we prize our liberty and our freedom. But equality is a fundamental tenet. But if you're not a citizen, you're not supposed to vote, at least in national elections. And we're equal, but how do you parcel out equality? Has anyone ever figured out the a good answer to that?
Well, one of the points that I try to stress in the book is that when you make an equality claim, you almost always explicitly or implicitly bring into effect an unequal as well. So if we say you and I are equals because, we both live in the Northeast of the United States, great. But what does that imply? That those who don't live there aren't equals, or you and I are equal as men, or you and I are equal as citizens of the United States, etc. And so equality claims always have embedded in them an idea that not all are equals. Now, people begin to challenge that beginning in the 18th century, proclaim the equality of all. My answer to that is always, well, that's great as long as you're not a non-human animal. You can be the king of the beast, the lion, but you're still dominated by human beings. And so the point being is that equality claims do factor out unequals. And you pointed to one of the principal ways that we order our world today around national citizenship. And you're right. People who aren't citizens in this country or in any other country of the world don't have the same rights that we do as citizens. And that's one way of making these distinctions.
Even on a on a national level, and you hear the argument, we've heard it again recently, and I don't think it's an argument that'll be settled, certainly probably in our useful lifetime. You go to the United Nations, right, and there's a Security Council. The Security Council has an impregnable veto. So in some ways, and I forget where this comes from. You probably know we're all equal, but some of us are more equal than others.
Yeah, that's Orwell. It's a great line, isn't it?
Genius.
Exactly. And this is something that, of course, critics of notions of equality point out very aptly, both from the left and for the right. You well know that in our Constitution of the United States, or in our Declaration of Independence, Jefferson and the founders proclaim universal equality. All men are created equal. But very quickly, when you scratch the surface there, we see that all kinds of groups were factored out at the time and since, right? If you were an indigenous person, a woman, a person of color, a non-citizen, as you say, an enslaved person, well, you didn't have the same rights and the same opportunities. And this is something that critics of liberalism will point out, that ideas of universal equality are often only skin deep.
Now, I want to go back about a decade or so, and I remember this very well, and I can't remember what the name of the book was. It Capital or something? Thomas Piketty's book, and it sort of, in my mind at least, it stirred up this incredible sort of rancor and obsession about inequality, economic inequality, and it was all the rage. And folks say how much the CEO made 5,000 times the compensation of the average salary worker. And my initial thing was, well, there's only one CEO and there's a lot of workers, so it makes for great press. But how relevant is it really? So why do you think? It seemed to me, and you correct me if I'm wrong, please do. Maybe it was after the financial crisis that we had all this attention on inequality, and we still have it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And Piketty was an important figure in this. And it points to something interesting. He's an economist, but most economists didn't study income distribution for most of the 20th century, either on the left or on the right. That was just not an issue that was on their radar screen. And as a consequence, they didn't study the history of economic equality or inequality. Now, one of the things that Piketty points out, and he's right about this, is that for most of the century, we lived in the Western nations, in the global North, in a period of compression. In other words, income equality and wealth equality were increasing from roughly the period of the First World War until the late 1970s. But that does begin to change in the 70s, and it starts to change quite dramatically in the 80s and 90s when you see creation of vast wealth, but then also opening up of chasms between the richer and the poor in the global North. CEO pay is a good example of that. Yet, as you can say, what does it matter if the CEO makes so much more? Well, they always have, but the proportion that they make more now is vastly increased since, say, the 1960s or 1970s. And that's true of wealth creation in the global North overall. There's a famous graph by my friend, the economist Branko Milanovic, called the elephant curve, that you may have seen that shows kind of global distribution of wealth. And what it shows is at the end of that distribution, it looks like the trunk of an elephant. You have a very small percentage of the world's very wealthy making more and more of the income share. And that's something that Piketty has pointed out. And I think he's right about that, even if one can sort of raise questions about some of his analysis. The other thing, though, what I like to point out to people is that at the very time, as you point out, that primarily Western observers started getting all obsessed about inequality. In other words, at the end of the 1970s into the 1980s, when the world as they saw it was becoming neoliberal, right? We got rid of the welfare state and relinquished certain taxes. And they're right that in the Western nations, inequality was increasing. But at the very same time, global inequality of both wealth and income was shrinking. Inequality was shrinking. Why? Because China was getting richer, India was getting richer, South Korea was getting richer, Singapore, Brazil, etc. And as that wealth creation, which took hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, it's the greatest reduction in poverty in human history. As those people entered closer to the global mean, global inequality as measured by individuals in the world actually fell. So the same period where Western intellectuals are exercised about inequality vis-a-vis countries like the United States or Great Britain or Germany or France is the same period that global inequality was falling for most of the 1880s, 90s, and into the 21st century. Now, that may have stopped in part because China and other countries have reached the global mean, and so further wealth creation there will actually skew distributions. But it was a pretty good run for a long time. So there are these ironies, which again go back to your initial point that equality of what and equality for whom?
It's interesting because you're an 18th century historian, right? And this goes back, probably maybe is it the early 18th century, the late, maybe even I think it might be the late 17th. My French history is not as good as it ought to be. But wouldn't you rather be a working class person now whose CEO makes a ton of money? You could argue, and some have argued that you're better off than Louis XIV. You have better health care. You have mobile phones. You have more entertainment than Louis. Louis had a lot of power and could make people do things. But outside of that, would you argue that a working class person today may have a standard of living better than the King of France?
Absolutely. And for most people in the world, that's absolutely true. It's a point that Adam Smith makes famously in The Wealth of Nations, where he says, your average worker in Scotland has more resources at his command than a king in Africa, as he puts it. And that's true. It's also true that when divisions between the wealthiest and the poorest are extreme, that can skew society and politics in really fundamental ways. And it's true that today we are getting very close to the greatest division between the wealthiest and the poorest in our history. 18th century America was actually a pretty equal place. Now, that was only for those Europeans who had come here, right? It didn't include, of course, the indigenous or the enslaved. But amongst the white European population, Gini coefficients, this is the economist measure of inequality, were actually very low. It was one of the lowest levels of inequality in the world at the time. And we're not there anymore. And as you say, we're vastly richer. And yes, this is a good thing. But I think one can have a kind of modicum of equality with wealth creation as well. And ultimately, I think we would be better off for it.
You mentioned Gini coefficients, and I've never dived real into exactly the methodology of how they calculate it, but it seems that it's from my cursory examination, it's basically a measure of relative sort of relative wealth and not absolutes. And you could probably argue that our Gini coefficient may be higher than countries that have more equal distribution, but that equal distribution could be to be provocative, could be Afghanistan may have a really low Gini coefficient, but boy, I think I'd rather be here than in Afghanistan.
Equality of poverty is not a good thing, right? People point this out that our hunter-gatherer ancestors in the prehistoric period. I write about them in my first chapter of my book. They probably had pretty low Gini coefficients. Obviously, we don't have the data to measure this, but we can figure things out. They lived in relatively equal ways. But as you say, they didn't have a whole lot, right? They were equal in part because they had nothing, right? Everything they owned, they could carry in their pockets and on their back. And that's clearly not the ideal, right? So what you're pointing out, quite rightly, is that equality is not an absolute good. We don't want it at any cost. But at the same time, I think equality, relative equality, can be a very good thing. And there's situations in which that's the case. We can talk about that.
I want to ask another sort of provocative question. And again, sometimes taking things to a little bit, towards an extreme, is beyond equality under the law before God, if you're a God-fearing person, is equality? I mean, equality actually a good? Because, and I ask that simply because attempts to impose equality seems to have more often than not, resulted in sometimes in disaster. In terms of, we want to level everything off, and as long as you have equality under the law and you have opportunity, has there been successful attempts to enforce sort of an equality, kind of an equality of outcome, I should say?
Sure. You're absolutely right that, at the extreme, imposing a kind of leveling equality is very dangerous. One of the examples that I write about in the book is the radical period of the French Revolution, the time of the Terror. The guillotine was referred to by both proponents and opponents as the scythe of equality. You literally cut people's heads off if they got too high above the rest, right? And that's an example of a kind of violent leveling equality that can be very, very dangerous. But there are forms of equalization that were more modest and I think more successful. And one could point to some of the social democratic regimes of Europe in the 20th century. One could point to the United States. I mean, I like to make the point to my conservative friends that, when our president invokes making America great again, it's not entirely clear when he's talking about, but often people think of the 1950s. And the 1950s was a far more equal period in American history than today. And what was good about that? Well, precisely what you talked about, opportunity, real opportunity, right? Schools that were comparable in different neighborhoods, people, because of the GI Bill, who had the opportunity to go to college and promote themselves. And I think the world that we live in today is more skewed, and it closes off paths to many people, which is a waste, in my view, of human capital, right? If you give people equal opportunities and you genuinely do that, as you say, outcomes won't be the same in the end. That we know, but they can be more similar than they are right now.
I want to take a step back, as I mentioned before, in terms of and I haven't studied, and perhaps you have a better view on this, and looking at a couple of centuries of equality in your book, is do we have we gotten sort of waves of greater inequality, and then it corrects, and then corrects, and then you get changes in the economy where you could, nobody used to be, you didn't get that many billionaires. I remember the Hunts were billionaires in 1980, and that was a really big deal. But now you can sell a piece of software, and sell it again and again and again, and you can be a billionaire. Do we find sort of corrections over time in terms of equality?
Yeah, and one has to be careful what you wish for. So I mentioned before this period that economists call the Great Compression, which comprises much of the 20th century. And from roughly the First World War to roughly the 1970s, one saw this compression in inequality. But what accounts for that? Well, to some degree, it was political will. Western democracies were worried about communism, what was going on there. And so they put tax measures and redistributions in place in order to equalize society so they could prevent revolution. But revolution or anarchy or state failure or war are often leveling forces. And you think about the Second World War or the First World War, all that capital destruction, right? All those workers killed, right? Which drives the cost of labor up and wages for those who stick around. That brought about a certain equalization, but at a terrible cost. And sometimes when things get too out of sync when the gap between the rich and the poor becomes too great, what happens? Well, people rise up with pitchforks and overthrow the state, and you have anarchy and total breakdown, and then one begins again. And I have a colleague at Stanford, Walter Scheidel, who wrote a great book about the history of inequality from the very beginning of human history until relatively recently. And he talks about the four horsemen of equalization, like the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And those were, as I say, state failure and revolution and plague and famine and war. Okay, and he argues that those are the things that bring about the equalization across human history and account for these adjustments, and they're terrible things. I think more optimistically, and this would be a point that Piketty and others would point out, is that politics can make a difference, right? We're not simply the passive playthings of economies. We can make choices by virtue of our politics about how we want to conduct our affairs. And there have been periods in our human history and in our history in the United States and the history of human beings where there's been a consensus that, you know what, we ought to do more to help the least fortunate, or we ought to do more to make sure that the schools in this school district are comparable to the schools in that district. We ought to do more to ensure that everyone has basic health care, right? And the same rough life prognosis. And, you know, we don't live in a period like that right now. We live in a period where people are very, very skeptical of efforts on the part of the state or anyone else to do these kind of things. But we're also living in a world that I think is very, very divided and very fractured. And part of that has to do with economic inequalities, which are massive right now.
You'll make a number of really good points there. It reminded me that you said, you know, a lot of people, you know, died during the war, and, you know, there were fewer workers, so workers got paid more. And, you know, if I recall my history correctly, the Black Death is said to have really leveled that. There were so, you know, fewer workers. It really changed the I suppose the master and serf interaction permanently. And the other thing, and what you'd say is, you know, you have Donald Trump now, MAGA. And you could argue that he is the least conservative Republican president since Dwight Eisenhower.
Not really at all.
He is actually
revolutionary.
He might be center, perhaps in some ways even center left. I mean, getting the government to take you know, stakes in big companies, that, you know, that would have been anathema not very long ago. So you make a very, very good point there. Do you have a sense that we are close to sort of a precipice in terms of, you know, pitchforks and, you know, a real rise in, you know, that would create a substantial change in, you know, what is, you know, a fairly unequal time now?
I always joke that I'm a historian, and so I know more about the past and the future, and I'm not very good at prognosis. It does feel to me, though, that we live in very precarious times, and whether the cauldron is going to boil over, I don't know. But I think there are a lot of people who look at the world and think it's out of sync, it's out of whack, and I think they look at this country in particular and think the same thing, that too many people have too little, and too few people have too much, or too many people have too much, and the thing is out of balance, out of whack. I think it's a wide sentiment on both the right and the left. I think that, you know, you pointed to Trump earlier as being in some ways kind of revolutionary, and clearly part of his base are people who look at the world and think it's out of whack, out of sync, it's been rigged, it's unfair to them. And whether Trump has answers for those folks in the end, I'm not sure. But clearly that's been part of his appeal. And I think those people have been brought into existence because of inequalities in our education system, in our health system, in the distribution of wages. I mean, you just look at, you know, the stagnation of wages for the white working class since the 1970s, and it's not good. And you can look at little blips, but at the same time that this country's gotten vastly wealthier, and people like you and I perhaps have done reasonably well. I think ordinary folks have really had a very, very difficult time. And the instability in our politics today is a reflection of that.
You're absolutely right. I mean, he you know, and I think historians, so perhaps a student of yours will someday write, you know, how Trump, you know, the phenomenon that he was, that nobody thought he ever had a chance ever, and, you know, has become, you know, an icon in some ways. So I want to shift gears a little bit, because you also wrote previous to Equality, you wrote a book called Divine Fury, A History of Genius, which, and I thought was really quite fascinating. And I mean, I guess in my, in my view, we sort of are, our society idolizes genius, whether it's, Michelangelo for perhaps, if you've ever seen the Pietà, you're like, how did this man like do that out of a block of marble? Or, Einstein, who changed how we look at the cosmos, to Steve Jobs, to Warren Buffett, the financier, and today Taylor Swift, a phenomenon on her own. So how do you reconcile the fact that we idolize or even valorize genius and exceptional and the extraordinary, yet we have this impulse for equality?
Yeah. Oh, it's a really important point. And in fact, it's right at the root of the study. So when I was working on the Genius book, it was really striking to me that the same period in human history that sees the emergence of the genius figure as a new kind of cultural icon, a new heroic figure, is the 18th century. And the 18th century is the same age that you begin to hear the proclamation that all men or all human beings are created equal, and that equality is a kind of important human value. And I asked the same question that you did. How do those two things go together? And one of the things that I noted in writing the Genius book is that genius served in the minds of many as a kind of antidote or foil to what they saw as the dangerous kind of leveling potential of equality. So I'll give you a specific example. Francis Galton, you may have heard that name. He was Charles Darwin's cousin. He's the founder and father of eugenics. And he was a scientist in 19th century England, whose first book was entitled Hereditary Genius. And he was interested in how geniuses are born, how often they come about. He was writing before genetics, actually, but he had an idea that genius was born, not made. And he thought of geniuses as, these kind of statistical freaks of nature who emerge, one in every 10 million or so in a population, but they are, as he put it, grand human animals born to be the kings of men. And he thought that democracy was kind of leveling these great figures, and that the genius needed to emerge to assert, great art, great thought, great leadership as a antidote, as I say, to the leveling forces of modern democracy and modern equality. So those two ideas go together, and they're kind of in tension from the 18th century, which I think points to something really important. And this is a central theme of my equality book, and that is that we human beings are these kind of schizophrenic animals. On the one hand, it's clear that we are hierarchical beings. We share about 98 or 99% of our DNA with the great apes, with chimpanzees and the like. And those great apes are intensely hierarchical beings, and so are we. Think about how invested we are in status, in distinguishing ourselves from others. We like to dominate others if we can. We don't like to be dominated. The fact that we don't like to be dominated is important because that leads to mechanisms to counter domination or to counter hierarchies. And this is something that I trace and I think is kind of embedded in us as human beings, but I trace as it develops over the centuries. So that we have, on the one hand, an inclination for status distinction, and we're drawn to those who rise above the crowd. And at the same time, we're a little bit distrustful of that, or a little bit resentful, and we want to pull those people down, right? The Australians call this the tall poppy syndrome. When one poppy grows up too high above the rest, you lop off the poppy, right? We pull people down to size when they get too big for their britches, as my father used to say. But on the other hand, we admire those people. And so, yes, we look up to the Elon Musks of the world who seem to be different from you or I, who have so much more, etc. And at the same time, we kind of resent them. And we're not so sure that they should have as much power and influence as they do. And that tension, I think, is always there in human societies in one form or another. And it plays out in different ways and at different times in human history.
It's an interesting interesting thing to look at, because you'd see Taylor Swift, who's an unbelievable icon. Nobody seems to really mind that she's a billionaire, practically a billionaire or thereabouts. I haven't looked that closely. Or Rihanna, because she had a great makeup business. And we don't mind that Steph Curry makes many tens of millions of dollars a year because he's a great athlete. It seems that there is, I don't know if it's politics or culture where, some wealth is bad and some wealth is okay. How do people sort of like organize that in their minds? What's okay and what is not okay?
Well, this is the $100 question, right? I can't shoot basketball like Steph Curry, and God bless him. He deserves to make all he can. Um, I think where it becomes a problem if Steph Curry's children, because of his wealth, get to go to schools that are better than the schools that my children go to, and because of the people he knows get internships in companies that my children can't do, and then has access to politicians and can, through contributions and lobbyists, have laws made in his or her favor in ways that I can't. And this is, I think, the distorting problem of vast inequalities of wealth. And we're seeing this right now. I mean, how many ordinary working class folks are in Congress? There ain't many, I can tell you, right? And how many ordinary working class folks have access to congressmen in the first place? They can't buy, the $10,000 plate to be at dinner. They can't get a one-on-one meeting with their representatives. And so then you start to get distortions, right? Politicians only listen to the people who can afford to speak to them, and that ripples out. And I think this is one of the problems. So, in theory, no, I think, Taylor Swift should be able to make as much money as she can. God bless her. But I think when one starts to multiply that out and you have a whole society in which you have winners and losers and not a whole lot of folks in between, you've got real problems. I would argue that the kind of bedrock of American society has always been a middle class, and that we're seeing the middle class kind of eviscerated, and this is problematic for our politics and for our society.
Yeah, you're right. I watched politics for a long time, and I can't remember, having been this divided. Now, my mind doesn't go back to Vietnam. I wasn't alive then, but I've asked people who did, and I think a majority of them say that it's worse today than it was in Vietnam, which says a lot, and not necessarily in a good way. You wrote the book about happiness, and we've talked about. We love genius, and maybe we don't mind paying for genius. We just don't like the inherited wealth, or perhaps the inherited privilege in some ways, as you aptly described it just now. So what would make us happy? I mean, I think that I always think that it's great that Warren Buffett is a multi-billionaire, but if I have and it's back to, if I have a decent living, I'm okay with that. I remember a high school teacher teaching me that it's really healthy to look at somebody very wealthy and say, I want to be just like him. But it's kind of unhealthy to say, I want to drag him down. And for a very long time, I think the U.S. was the former, as opposed to, certain countries, perhaps, France is maybe a good one, the latter. But we sort of moved towards the sort of, there's almost like envy in it. So if we get more equality, is it actually going to make us happy?
Very complicated question, but you brought together many of my interests, right? Genius, inequality, and happiness. And again, I would say that in the extreme, you're absolutely right. There's no direct correlation between income or wealth equality and happiness. And so it's not as if a more equal society would be a happier one. A good example is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wasn't invested in equality, but it had egalitarian effects. And if you looked at Gini coefficients in the Soviet sphere in the 60s or 70s, they were lower than they were in the West. But clearly, people weren't happy there. And so equality doesn't bring happiness, can bring collective misery indeed. On the other hand, vastly distorted societies have all kinds of other problems. And one of them is, what the great Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam has called social capital. It's, just like physical capital, the warehouses and the buildings and the machinery that's needed to keep societies together. We need to have trust in one another. We need to have networks. We need to have associations and organizations to make things happen and get things done. And when you have vast distortions in society because of economic differences, People's kids don't play in the same little league clubs. People don't go to school together. People live in separate neighborhoods and they don't have anything to do with one another. People don't intermarry. They become kind of foreign to each other, right? An alien species, and they don't understand each other. And when they don't understand each other, they can't facilitate change. And so we know that where social capital is low, so is happiness, right? And American happiness has fallen precipitously in the last 15 or 20 years. And I think that's really interesting. It's fallen precipitously at the same time that inequality has increased. And as you were pointing out earlier, our trust in one another, our regard for one another has declined. And this is problematic. So I think there's a happier medium, a happier place than we are now. And again, that doesn't mean that we can have great happiness by leveling everything and pulling through resentment, envy, the rich down to our level. But on the other hand, I think a more equitable and equal distribution of opportunity and outcome would do us better in terms of happiness and the possibility of attaining it.
Is the answer to this more progressive taxation? I mean, you could argue with that, at least in the U.S. Or maybe not as much as in other countries. We have a fairly progressive tax base where, the top 2% pay, I think top 5% certainly probably pay, half of the personal income taxes. Is the answer to make that even more progressive? Or maybe a happier medium, as you'd say, is to increase the social capital of people. The working class, you said, have really not seen their incomes increase in a real way in a long time. That we increase the social capital of people who don't have it, and that's perhaps less painful than a much more progressive tax base, or something even worse.
Well, look, a couple things. I mean, social capital costs money, and you need to get money somewhere. And so, if you want to increase social capital, you want to have better schools, and you want to have better healthcare, and you want to have things that give people an equal foot, that's going to require money. It's also true that historically our taxes are much, much lower than they've been in our history. Again, the time when America was great, well, right after the Second World War, or right after in the 1940s, we were paying vastly greater taxes. Now, was that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, but you got a different kind of society, right? And there was more of a collective buy-in as well. War does that, right? When the nation's at war, you can't afford to just keep your wealth to yourself. You need to contribute to help the cause, and this happened. So I think we could pay more taxes. Frankly, this is never popular, but Americans don't, I think, understand how good we have it right now. And relative to our history, we pay far fewer taxes now than we have. So that's one thing. I mean, I think, another thing would be to think about inheritance taxes, right? I always talk about this with my mother, and my mother's worked very hard to put what she's accumulated in her life together, and she hates the idea of having to give any of that to the government. I totally understand that. I think, it's a natural kind of human thing. At the same time, is it really right or fair to bring people into the world who have vastly, vastly greater life chances because of what their parents did, right? We talked about equality of opportunity before. I'm sorry, but if you're the son or daughter of a billionaire, your opportunity is vastly greater than would be an ordinary person. And so I think we could probably do more in terms of inheritance tax. Again, this is not a popular line right now, but in times of total distortion, it can become so, right? When people get so sick of the disparities and disconnects in a society, they start to change their tune about things. And it may be that we have to make some painful sacrifices for the greater good as a way of avoiding kind of social fracture, social breakdown, or the specter of revolution or civil war.
It's certainly, on the other hand, and I understand from your mother's point of view, worked really hard, and I want to give it to my children and my grandchildren. Why should the death of a loved one be a taxable event? But there is something to be said for, you do want, sort of comity, and, we don't have that. Stepping away, and this has been a great discussion. You've written books about happiness and and equality and genius. So, what's the next big idea that you think you might tackle?
So I've got an idea that I want to write before I die. I want to write about change, how human beings look at change, how they understand it, how they imagine it. I think, we can argue that we live in a period of human history in which we've seen greater social change and technological change in a shorter amount of time than ever before. And I want to look at that, how that's evolved historically. I like to make the point that almost all cultures, their view of the divine or God is of a changeless being, right? God is immutable, unchanging, and human beings in the material world live in a period of live in a state of constant flux. But that varies from period to period, and so I'm interested in that idea, how human beings regard change and its possibilities. In the meantime, though, I've been working on a kind of funny project on lighting in the age of Enlightenment, lighting in the 18th century. It's often not remarked that the period that we call the Enlightenment, this birth of kind of culture and art and intellect in the 18th century, is also the first period in human history to start lighting cities at scale. And I ask in my very boneheaded way, I wonder if there's any relationship between the Enlightenment and lighting. And it turns out that there's a lot, that many people we associate with the Enlightenment, like Benjamin Franklin, for example, are also really interested in lighting technologies. Benjamin Franklin is sort of responsible for getting the streets of Philadelphia lit. It's one of the first cities in America to have public lighting. His father was a tallow chandler. He made candles. And so he's really interested in light, what it is, and how to implement it for human progress. And this is something that we take for granted today, but think about how dramatically lighting changes life. Right? Until the 18th century, basically, people went to bed when the sun went down, and they got up when the sun came up. And they didn't venture out of their houses in the dark because it was scary out there. Right? There were criminals and bad people. Well, that begins to change when you light streets in the night. People go out to plays. They start eating dinner later. They go to restaurants. They start to shop. Right? And you can trace all this in the social history in the 18th and 19th century, how shops start to open in the evening, commerce happens at night, sociability happens at night. People start drinking coffee because they're sleeping less and they need to stay up. And we work around the clock now. So I'm writing a little book about public lighting in the age of enlightenment, which may be one of these books like the first one I mentioned that my parents will scratch their head and say, why are you writing about something that only 10 people are interested in? But I'm going to try to make it interesting to more than 10, and then hopefully go on to another big meaty idea, this idea of change.
In our conversation, and I think, by the way, I think this lighting idea is great. I mean, how much unbelievably greater is our productivity? We can work till, well, all hours of the night. May not be good for happiness, but it's good for productivity. um, we come back to the 18th century, and I would say that's mostly before the cities were lit. Why was the 18th, I guess the 17th, 18th century, why was that this explosion of ideas, how we do changes in what we think about equality and happiness and genius? Why did that happen in your view in that period of time?
It's a great question, and there's no simple answer to it, unfortunately. And a lot of people have had theories about it. Some theories are focused on the economic dynamism of the time, right? That this is the beginning of industrialization and capitalism, right? Why that explosion? Lots of different theories about why that happens, right? Was it because serfs are released from estates and can go to cities and work freely? The guilds and their strictures on the labor market are eroded. Was it because of greater tolerance? Unclear. But I think there's probably an economic piece to the question. There's this intellectual piece, right? That people begin to break out of the strictures that had bound them until that time, begin to think for themselves. One of the mottos of the Enlightenment by the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, actually taken from a Roman thinker, Horace, is sapere aude, dare to know, right? Dare to think and to challenge and to put put all notions and ideas and institutions to kind of critical examination. And the 18th century fosters that way of thinking, and this leads to all kinds of innovations in government, in culture, in religion, in economics. But what the big underlying cause, there are probably many, right? And I'm not going to be able to give you just a single one off the bat, although that would make life easier for everyone.
We love the magic bullet. Well, Professor McMahon, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. This has been a great conversation, and looking forward to seeing your book on writing and then your book on change.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
That's
much.
great. Yeah, absolutely. We'll be in touch.